centuries now, King Arthur has been a mystery to historians. Was his story of Guinevere and Camelot and Excalibur simply an elaborate fairy tale, or was he a flesh and blood king? And if that's the case, just how different is the legend from the reality?
The figure of Arthur in history is probably massively different from the romantic, ideal, medieval king that we see.
I'm sure there was a great British leader called Arthur, but there was no Camelot, there was no Guinevere, and there was no great sword called Excalibur.
There could well have been a warrior called a Welsh variation of Arthur, but in the very early chronicles, he is not mentioned at all.
He was actually more likely a soldier in common, simple garb and living on a hill fort made out of wood, not in the fancy castle.
He wasn't a hair-flowing, sort of Brad Pittish kind of King Arthur. He was a tough dude, and he was acknowledged as a warrior and buried as a warrior.
For nearly 1,000 years, King Arthur has remained a mystery. The site of his fabled Camelot long forgotten, and the true location of his final resting place shrouded in the mists of time. So who was he? Where was he from? And did he really exist at all?
King Arthur is a legendary British military leader of the late 5th and early 6th centuries who led his people at a time of, great adversity against what appears to be the Saxon army and reinstilled sort of faith and independence in the land.
King Arthur that most people think about is a man in a suit of armor, on horseback, wielding a big sword and so on, when in reality, he comes from something about 500 years at least before the suit of armors were invented. He's going to be wearing leather armor. He's going to be probably on foot, leading a group of ex-Roman mercenaries. That's closer to the truth.
The mythologizing of King Arthur happened during the Middle Ages, so people imagined him to be a king or a warrior as they understood it, in armor, with a castle. The reality, of course, he would have been a Romano-British warrior. He wouldn't have been a castle, it would have been a hill fort. They didn't have armor as such then, and maybe just a breastplate.
We see these medieval romance writers really trying to, make something more of the story than what it was. It was very romantic, wasn't it? That you had this king in this wonderful castle and the beautiful queen, the huge table where everyone came together. It's a great story, but it's not reality.
There are three main theories as to the identity of King Arthur. The first is that he was a Dark Age king from Tintagel in Cornwall. The second is that he was a Roman Briton from the England-Wales border and helped defeat the Saxons. And the third, and arguably the most popular, is that he was from here, in Glastonbury, and was buried in this very abbey. Tor Webster is a local historian based here in Glastonbury who takes people on tours of the main Arthurian sites in the area. He believes that King Arthur did live nearby and was even buried here in the abbey for a period. This is a great place, Tor.
Yeah, it was the second largest and most affluent abbey in the whole of England at its time, after Westminster.
Is that right?
Yeah, even sometimes more important than Westminster, so it was a very important site.
What have we got here?
So yeah, first I'd like to show you this. This is said to be the site where King Arthur and Guinevere's bodies were discovered by the monks in 1191.
Okay.
And,
why do we think it was actually them?
Well, they found a plaque saying here lies King Arthur and Guinevere, so that was kind of proof to the monks that that was what they had discovered here.
Okay. There was nothing buried with them that might suggest that
Not as far as I know, apart from the plaque and the description also of how they were buried in historical.
And why Glastonbury?
Well, it's believed that King Arthur was one of the early Christian kings, and this is where Joseph of Arimathea, Mary Magdalene, and Mary the Mother came and settled on this island, which in those days we believe called Innis Wittering, and they built the first ever Christian church here in 62 AD, the Wattle Church. Later on the Saxons called it the Old Church, and then the abbey was built up around that Wattle Church. So it's very important to them.
And then there are no bones here now, though, right?
It's said that the monks moved them in a great ceremony up to near the high altar in the great church and put them in tombs there with black marble lids.
OK, so we're going to take a look?
Sure, let's go.
Much of the abbey has been destroyed over the years. First by King Henry VIII in the dissolution of the monasteries in the 16th century, and later just through neglect and the passage of time. What's left, though, is truly beautiful and enigmatic, and a fitting place for a royal burial. So are we in the abbey now, then?
Oh, yeah, very much so. This is the high altar over here, and this is the site where the monks moved the bodies of King Arthur and his bride Guinevere, and in a big ceremony placed their bodies in two tombs, both with black marble lids.
OK. So are the bones in here now, are they?
No, we believe that when the disillusionment of the abbey in 1539, they were most likely have been moved around that time by the monks, that they might have taken a lot of the artifacts and quickly buried them somewhere else in the landscape here. So we don't really know what happened to them.
You know, the industry of Arthur is huge, probably in the tens of millions. Movies, books, tours. And at Glastonbury today, you go there, I must say it's quite moving. You see the little plaque that says, here, and it's very humble. It's not like a big sign, it's a tiny little plaque. Here lies King Arthur and his wife Guinevere. And it's really rather moving and understated, which almost gives it a little bit of credibility. It's a shame it's fiction.
When the monks of Glastonbury allegedly found the coffin of Arthur and, as it said, his second wife, Guinevere, they made a lot of money out of it, and to some extent Glastonbury still does, because people know about this, and it pulled in the pilgrims, pulls in the tourists now. But there was something very odd, I think, about the inscription anyway. It says, here lies the famous King Arthur with his second wife, Guinevere, here in the Isle of Avalon. You would not, on the inscription of a royal tomb, say the famous. For example, it doesn't say on Elizabeth I's tomb, here lies the famous Elizabeth I. I mean, it's just ridiculous. It's unsubtle and it's quite clearly invented.
Why Glastonbury Abbey should be the Vale of Avalon? Very good question. Certainly in the 11th century, the monks did find two skeletons, a man and a woman. They believed them to be Arthur and Guinevere. There isn't a shred of evidence to say that it was them, that that's where they were buried and that's where Arthur was taken. But it's a jolly good story, and it's made Glastonbury a tourist attraction for the best part of 1,000 years, and it sold a lot of ice creams.
Well, one theory is that the bodies that they moved to the area of the high altar were not that of King Arthur and Guinevere, that they were actually Joseph of Arimathea and Mary Magdalene. I personally don't believe that to be the case, but it's interesting, the connection between them, because Joseph of Arimathea was a very important figure to the Arthurian legend, bringing the Holy Grail to here, which I believe actually was Mary Magdalene. She was the Holy Grail.
I read a theory that the monks made the whole thing up, and that obviously having Arthur's relics here would have attracted pilgrims, and pilgrims were good for business. What do you make of that?
Well, that's one theory. I personally believe that it was King Arthur and Guinevere buried here, But, you know, it's a story at the end of the day, and it's an archetypal story, and I think that's really what's important, not so much the ins and outs of it, you know.
The modern sort of Hollywood legend of Arthur originates sort of in the 12th and 13th century with the Grail romances and really commences with Mallory a few hundred years later, putting the icing on the cake of the story. And each of them embellishes it in a different way. One of them adds Arthur has a wife, Guinevere, and he has a father, Uther Pendragon, and there's this chap named Merlin, and oh, here's Excalibur, and guess what? They all live in this amazing romantic place called Camelot. They each add a little bit to the story slowly, 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 to the point where it's the epic we know today.
Do you believe King Arthur and Guinevere were once buried here, or do you think it's simply myth and legend?
I think it's very possible that King Arthur and Guinevere are buried right here, and that their bodies stayed there until the abbey was destroyed in 1539, and the monks moved their bodies to somewhere else in the landscape and buried there. But who knows? Your guess is as good as mine.
In ancient times, there were no lottery grants. You had to get money from pilgrims, and Glastonbury Abbey had burnt down. A few years later, in 1191, they contrived to announce they found the bones of King Arthur and his wife. And so it makes sense. They wanted money. They wanted pilgrims. They wanted to rebuild and expand their wonderful abbey.
The whole story of the monks finding King Arthur's bones and Guinevere's was, you know, a great marketing story. It brought people into the town. They could then rebuild their church after the fire, and we still see this kind of tourism existing today. People want to come and touch a bit of Arthur. They want to see where he was buried, when in actuality, he wasn't buried there. Great story, but not reality.
You can't come to Glastonbury and not walk up to see the Tor, the ancient monument. It's quite a climb, over 500 feet to the top of the hill, but it's well worth the effort.
There it is. So that's where we're...
The abbey behind that hill there, Chalice Hill.
Oh, this is Chalice, so the abbey's
Chalice
just down
Hill.
here. Oh, well, I can see that's the... what's the church there?
St. John's Church,
St. John's Church?
Yeah.
So what was significant about the Tor then?
Well, it's a great landscape marker, and people say that over 100 ley lines converge on here, creating a very special energy.
So is this Avalon, when people refer to Avalon?
Yeah, this is the ancient Isle of Avalon we're standing on here. All around us, the Somerset levels, this was all water 600 years ago.
So do you think that Arthur would have once stood up here on top of the Tor?
Oh yeah, for sure, for sure. Surveying his kingdom.
The truth is, Glastonbury ticks the boxes for what the historical Avalon should have. But is it chicken and egg? Which came first? The truth is, the historical sort of Arthur and probably Camelot would be more along Middle England, North Wales, that vicinity. That makes much more sense. So it makes you wonder if the region around Glastonbury, which is, you know, sacred in its own right, didn't grow up with this sort of mythology in mind.
I have to say that being up here, standing on what could have been the ancient site of Avalon, is quite something. And it's true, you can imagine King Arthur on this hill, looking out across water, lord and ruler of all he could see. But Glastonbury isn't the only place in Britain that lays claim to be Arthur's home. I'm on my way to meet a historian who spent the past 2 decades or so trying to unravel the truth about the real historical King Arthur. And the good news is, he thinks he might have cracked it. Historian Graham Phillips's research has led him to a high-status burial ground on the Welsh borders, where he believes the great king is buried. I met up with him at a hotel in Shrewsbury to discuss his findings. What do you got to show me?
Right, what we have here is 300 years before the first of the Arthurian romances were written in the Middle Ages. You've got this record kept by Welsh priests. It's known as the Welsh Annals, and it refers to events throughout all of Britain that happened during the Dark Ages, so in the 5th, 6th century and so forth. And we find recorded for what is approximately the year 520 thereabouts, the Battle of Badon, in which Arthur carried the cross of our Lord Jesus on his shoulders for 3 days and 3 nights, and the Britons were victorious. That's the way that these monks would write about it. But it's a matter-of-fact, normal way of recording battles. And Arthur is there. Arthur is victorious.
But how do we know this is our Arthur and not any other Arthur?
The reason why, for a start, is the Battle of Badon. All the stories that were written in the Middle Ages have Arthur's greatest battle as the Battle of Badon. You've got another reference to Arthur here. We know 20 years separates them. And this says the Battle of Camelot, in which Arthur and Modred perished. Now, in the Middle Ages, the story is that Arthur died at the Battle of Camelot, fighting his treacherous nephew Modred. So it certainly seems that by the late 800s, these people who are writing these records of their own history believe Arthur to have been a very real historical figure.
And this predates the Arthurian legend of Camelot and Guinevere and Excalibur and all that kind of...
By at least 3 centuries.
Wow.
3 centuries.
If he was, as I strongly suspect, a Dux Bellorum, a Roman war leader, he would have been wearing a Roman soldier's kit with a breastplate and leg armour. He would have had a short Roman sword and a very effective Roman shield, plus a Roman-style helmet on his head. There would have been none of this later armour of the kind that one normally sees in museums and Hollywood films.
Through his research, Graham has uncovered an 8th century manuscript written by a Welsh monk called Nennius, which tells of a British leader called Arthur who made a successful stand against the invading Anglo-Saxons from Denmark and northern Germany.
Nennius refers to Arthur. He says that Arthur fought against the Anglo-Saxons, and then he lists 12 of their battles.
Right.
12 battles that Arthur had against them in which he was victorious. And he just mentions in matter of fact, without any kind of elaboration or mythology or anything, Arthur is a down-to-earth warrior fighting the Anglo-Saxons.
What does it? Where's the Arthurian reference there? Oh, right. Una Artur. Is that right? No.
Basically, what it says is, in that time, the Saxons strengthened in multitude and grew in Britain. On the death of Hengist, Otho, his son, passed from the northern part of Britain to the kingdom of Kent, and from him descend the kings of Kent. That's just referring to an ordinary situation concerning the kings of the Anglo-Saxons,
right.
Hengist being one of them. And then it says straight after, then Arthur fought against them in those days with the kings of the Britons, but he himself was leader of battles and often victorious. He was leader in 12 battles fought against the Saxons, and then he lists them.
I sense we're getting closer and closer. It's quite clear that he was a leader of Britons and he led them into battle, which was what a king would have done.
Precisely.
The archaeology shows that the area around Middle England, the Welsh border, it was under assault, and there was a period in history when the Saxon invasion was stopped, and it was stopped right there. So the military leader who did that, he would have been a hero. So it fits. Historically, that's probably where he would have lived.
Graham's research into ancient texts of early Britain uncovered another gem, a story by a monk called Gildas, about 100 years later, describing the exploits of a local king whose battle name was De Urso, or the Bear.
Now, Gildas wrote around about 445 AD. Now, he is writing within living memory of Arthur's time.
Wow, so that's as close as you're going to get.
That's as close as you're going to get. Now, unfortunately, he doesn't talk about King Arthur, and many historians have said, well, that proves that Arthur didn't exist, because Gildas doesn't mention him. But he does mention somebody here called de Urso. That is basically the bear.
OK, and there's a picture, because this is like an illuminated
manuscript. It's an illuminated manuscript. Now, he refers to a number of British kings by their battle names. Now, what Gildas actually tells us about the bear is as follows. He's actually talking about somebody who's alive while he was alive. Why dost thou also wallow in the old filth of thy wickedness from the years of thy youth, thou bear, rider of many and driver of the chariot of the bear's stronghold, despiser of God, etc. And then he calls him by his name, Cuniglas.
There was a real King Arthur, but we're talking Saxon times. Think Roman centurion. Think somebody who's dressed in battle wear, not in knightly clothes on a horse. That comes 500-600 years later. He's living in a hill fort. And the sword that he uses, Excalibur, that didn't exist for many hundreds of years. There was no 12-foot broadsword. There were much cruder axes and instruments that were used around the time of the true Arthur.
I think it's much more credible, the idea that he would have been a British-born Roman leader. That's much more credible than something that's way out there like we see in the medieval romances. I think there's evidence to that. We can't make a definitive decision about it, but we have to leave open to it. But I think that definitely it's an important possibility to consider.
Using his detailed research, with access to the ancient documents at the British Library, Graham says that Cuniglas, or Kinglas in Welsh, was son of a warlord known as Owain Llangwyn, the real historical King Arthur, also known as the Bear. Interestingly, his descendants in the Middle Ages were the Earls of Warwick, whose family symbol was, yep, you guessed it, a bear.
So, you look next to bear in English and see what the Welsh equivalent is.
Bear, Arthes. Arthur.
Precisely. The actual modern Welsh and in Old Brythonic, the language spoken at the time in Britain, the word for bear is arth.
Arth.
And in Brythonic, Arthur means the bear. So, at the time we believe that King Arthur existed, there is a man whose name would have been pronounced locally as Arthur. So I'm saying that I found Arthur, and the reason why no one's dug up anything saying here lies Arthur or anything is because that wasn't his real name.
In the Arthurian romances, King Arthur is said to have ruled from a magnificent fortified city called Camelot. However, its site has never been discovered, but digging into the historical texts, Graham believes that he may have found its real location. Historically, around 500 AD, Britain had fragmented into a number of smaller kingdoms, the largest and strongest of which appears to have been the Kingdom of Powys. Now merely a Welsh county, in the late 5th and early 6th centuries, Powys covered much of what are now the Midlands of England and central Wales. Its capital was Viriconium, once a thriving Roman town that became the most important city in the country during the post-Roman era. And it was here, Graham believes, that the real historical Arthur, Owain Llangwyn, ruled.
Why do you think that this place was Camelot?
Well, the evidence is twofold. Firstly, we have the archaeological side of things, and that is that this particular place, Viriconium, around the year 500, when Arthur is said to have lived, was the most sophisticated and powerful city in the country. The other three major cities of England, during the period the Romans were here, had all been invaded by the Anglo-Saxons. That's London, Lincoln and York on the eastern side. This then remained as the capital of Britain at the time Arthur is said to have lived. So what I try to do is to say, well, if Arthur really did exist, and he did rule from the most powerful city in the country, as the legend says, then this is the most likely place he would have come from.
From the, shall we say, pictorial castle of the type that Disney would have favoured, the real fairy tale castle with its turrets and towers and battlements, what Arthur more than likely had as a fortified enclosure was a very simple Anglo-Saxon type hill fort, or a Roman type hill fort, mainly wooden stakes pointing outwards towards the enemy to slow them down as the defenders got rid of them.
The last archaeological excavation at Viriconium took place in the 1990s and revealed that there was a major rebuilding of the city around AD 500. The nerve centre was a palace of an extremely important chieftain, possibly the real historical King Arthur, Owen Llan Gwyn.
So this is all Roman, is it?
This is Roman, but then rebuilt at the Arthurian period into the most astonishing defensive structure. I mean, that would probably have been the outer wall of Arthur's inner defences, or his mansion, if you like, or palace.
Right. So you believe then that Arthur would have lived here, or this would have been his...
This was both a defensive structure, a court, and a hive of industry. They made swords, weapons here. There was farming going on around it. So it was, I mean, in legend, Arthur's Camelot is said to have been both a fort and a grand city, and that's what this was.
Thing is, right, why wasn't it called Camelot?
Ah, now that's a good point. If we were looking for somewhere called Camelot and we could just look on a map and say, oh, that's Cam something, and people have done that, then that would have been a lot easier to have found Arthur's seat of power in the first place. But unfortunately, looking for somewhere called Camelot doesn't work. It was the invention, the name was the invention of a French poet by the name of Chrétien de Troyes in 1190, in a poem he wrote called Lancelot, and he needed a word to rhyme with Lancelot.
Oh, and that's
and hence Camelot.
The real King Arthur was most likely a Roman leader. He wasn't the King Arthur we think of today from medieval romance, of living in the fancy castle on the hill. The legend of Camelot, of Guinevere, of Excalibur, these are all medieval additions that were added to the romance and to add to the intrigue of the story.
It's very likely that there was a historical figure who fits the bill for what's described about this military leader who led the assault against the Saxons. But more likely than not, Arthur would have been a title, not their name. And it's very possible, think about it, he would have been a Roman military leader, and where would he have lived? Probably in one of the 2 or 3 big Roman concentration capitals throughout Middle England.
Almost certainly, if Arthur really existed, he was a Welsh warrior. He was, if not from Wales itself, then from the Welsh-English borders. But still, the question is, did he really exist?
I understand what you're saying, but what I really need is something that tells me that King Arthur did exist and wasn't just a myth and a legend, some tangible evidence that suggests that he might have actually existed.
There is. Now, we've seen that Owen Llan Gwyn was called Arthur the Bear and that he ruled from here. What archaeologists found when digging here was quite a bit more about the history of the kings of Powys, this area.
Right.
And Owen Llan Gwyn had a father who also had a battle name. And that battle name was the Terrible Head Dragon. Reason for that is that his father had been king of another kingdom in North Wales.
And the dragon
became the symbol of Wales.
Yeah.
So we know that the dragon is the symbol of these people. That was his father. He kind of split off and came here, did Owen. His father was called the Terrible Head Dragon. Translate that into Welsh, and it is Uther Pendragon. The terrible, as in mighty, Uthra. Pen, head. Dragon is the same. The terrible head dragon, Uther Pendragon. So not only do we have a man here whose name was Arthur, who ruled from this most powerful city, his father was called Uther Pendragon, exactly the same as we are told that Arthur's father's name was.
It's interesting that it's the Celtic countries that really bring out the Arthur archetype. And it's a time when you need that savior archetype. The Crusades haven't gone that well, and the Celtic lands are in need of believing in something and feeling good about themselves. And that's exactly what this legend allows them to do.
So where are we heading to now, Graham?
We're heading to a place called Ridi Gros, which is Welsh for Ford of the Cross. And it's here that my research suggests very strongly that King Arthur died.
Why do you believe it to be the place where King Arthur died?
The very oldest of the Arthurian stories, Dark Age war poems that refers to Arthur's death, says that he died at the Battle of Camelot, C-A-M-L-A-N-N, and where he's actually encamped just before the battle is said to be at Ridi Gros. Now, there are very few places still called that in the country. There's only one anywhere around Viraconium, about 12 miles to the southwest, and that's where we're going, because that is where I believe Arthur's last battle was fought, because of the name, Ridi Gros. This just coming up here is wait a minute, we should be able to see it. Yes, that's it. That is it.
Take a look.
So this is the bridge in question. But back in the period that Arthur lived, this was actually a ford.
Right.
And if you remember, the earliest reference to where Arthur fought his very last battle, the Battle of Camelot, is said to have been at Ridi Gros, which is also said to have been a ford across a river. And this is the place, I believe, that earliest reference to Arthur's final battle where he died actually refers to.
So this was the battlefield here, was it?
Well, we don't actually know. There's been no archaeological work done here because no one's had any reason to do any archaeological work. It's only me who has worked out that this is the Ridi Gros in question. It fits with the geography of the description of the last battle, according to the old Welsh poem, because it says Arthur's main forces are in a fort a mile away. Now, right over there, at the top of that hill, a mile away, pretty much, is an old fort, which was a Roman fort, which was still being used. We know this because it's been excavated at the time Arthur is said to have lived. And so Arthur has his horsemen, his cavalry, a mile away, encamped around this ford of the cross, Ridi Gros. This is also the boundary between Arthur's kingdom, if he is Owen Thangwyn, as I believe, of Powys on the one side, and his nephew, Maglacunas' kingdom of Gwynedd, that side. So that this would have been a place where they might have met for battle.
And how far away are we from Camelot now?
About 12 miles. And this road here is the road that went there. So you can see them, two armies moving, one from out of Wales and one from Camelot area.
This is where they would have met.
And this is where they would have met.
Whether it's fact or fiction, whatever you believe, the King Arthur story continues to be as vital today as it was 1,000 years ago. And that's because it's about hope, it's about romance, it's about the fact that times are tough, but you know what? Around the corner, they're probably gonna get better.
So this site has never been excavated, has it? This is very much your theory.
Yes, well, totally. I mean, nobody has excavated this site because, for a start, there's no historical evidence other than what I've discovered about Arthur that suggests that there's any reason to excavate it.
Right.
But from the Arthurian point of view, we've got a place called Ridigros, the Ford of the Cross, the River Camelot, the fact that it's near Vericonium, all really tie up when you put my theory together about who Arthur was and where he came from. But other people tend to believe that Arthur came from the southwest of England, Glastonbury, for example. So they've looked for somewhere called maybe the Ford of the Cross, Ridigros, in that area, and they've not found one. No one seems to have put two and two together and come across this. But then again, if you don't believe my theory in the first place about where Camelot was and who Arthur was, you probably wouldn't think of looking here.
Graham's research has also found evidence for where he believes the historical King Arthur was actually buried. It's just outside a sleepy Shropshire village called Basschurch.
Just here, and we'll have a look at that gate just over there, and you'll be able to get a very good view of it, I think, if the map is correct.
Okay.
So if we look across those fields, it should stand out pretty... Ah, there it is. There it is. You can see on the horizon there.
Yeah.
Rising up with the trees on it by those pylons. That there was basically a natural hillock which has had earthworks added to it, a series of embankments and so forth built round it. It's like defensive. But going back 1,500 years, the whole of this area was water. It was a lake. It's been drained over the years to create farmland.
So that would have been an island?
An island in the middle of a lake.
And you believe that to be the final resting place of King Arthur?
That place has got to have been the Churches of Bassa mentioned in the poem. We know that that Churches of Bassa place is where the kings of Powys, all of them, were buried. If Owen Llangwyn was Arthur, as I believe, then he was buried there. So that, if you like, is the final burial place of King Arthur, the historical Avalon.
But in the poem, it talks about the churches. There are no churches here.
The limited amount of archaeology that has been done on that mound has shown there was 2 or 3 wooden structures, early Christian churches dating from the post-Roman period. They tended to be built in groups of 2 or 3, each dedicated to a different saint. They would have been on that mound.
And if King Arthur is buried there, what would you expect to find?
The way that we know from various Roman accounts of how the Britons buried their dead was they buried them in oval-shaped pits in the ground, 6 feet deep, and they would bury them very often with their shield. So you'd got a single grave, somebody under the ground in an unmarked grave, you wouldn't have had a stone on top, buried probably on their side with their shield on their arm. We did last year a geophysics scan of the area, and archaeologists came up with this. That is for that area over there, which I've pointed out to you. That particular part of the hill that's on the left, the slope there, and it's about halfway down there. The reason I got them to do a geophysics scan in that area is because, according to the poem, that's where the first king is buried, and the first king, I believe, is the man who was Arthur. So, first question, is there anybody buried there? And what they discovered, here's a printout of the geophysics scan. It's like a Jackson Pollock painting to the rest of us. It doesn't mean anything. But what this means to the geophysicist, this is the area of ground. These are stones, different types of things under the ground. But it's this here that's really interesting. That denotes an oval-shaped pit about 6 foot deep, 6 foot across. And this large black oblong in the middle represents a large ferrous object, an iron, something iron. And they've...
Possibly a shield?
Absolutely. That's exactly what they suggested. I didn't say we may be looking for somebody with a shield. They said, we think there could be a burial there with somebody with a shield. We don't know how old it is, but it does fit in perfectly with the kind of burials of 1,500 years ago.
So this could be one of the greatest, most legendary kings of England, that black blob. That's the closest.
Precisely. Richard III, eat your heart out. That black blob is
him.
better.
I think, you know, the professional academics, the professional historians, they don't take kindly to amateurs, you know, particularly when it's a kind of treasure hunt scenario of, you know, trying to track down some legend. Because after all, they're the experts. They don't want the, you know, amateurs like Graham Phillips and Adrian Gilbert muscling in and proving them wrong. So I don't think there's like a conspiracy to conceal the truth about Arthur, but I certainly think there is a reluctance to allow people to sort of dig on the say-so of the non-professionals, shall we say.
I really like the work of what Graham Phillips has done in this area. He's gone to the original sort of source material, which points towards a historical figure, late 5th century, Middle England, sort of Welsh border area, a military leader who has a title that is associated with Arthur the Bear, and he has even dwindled it down to a specific earth mound that sound scans would indicate is a chieftain with some kind of shield. So if anyone's going to pinpoint the historical King Arthur, I think Graham Phillips has a pretty good chance.
I'm certainly all for amateurs being able to further knowledge about certain historical characters and being accepted as doing that. And it's only really the passion of people who've committed their lives to studying these things that you ever move anything on. I mean, look at the Richard III excavations as a perfect example. If Arthur was high status, if he existed and he was high status, there will be a burial out there somewhere, and maybe somebody should dig.
I think there's a definite possibility that we could find Arthur and uncover where he might be buried. But the tricky part comes in where could we find the link to actually authenticate that it was Arthur? Will there be evidence buried with him that could authenticate that it's actually Arthur himself?
Who knows? They've found recently a burial site with a great king leader buried with his sword and his shield. There is a possibility that we may actually find, after all these years, the real King Arthur.
If, it's a big if they give him permission to dig, I think we may very well find the historical King Arthur after all this time.
So could this burial mound behind me really be the final resting place of the man we know to be King Arthur? Well, until Graham gets permission to do his excavations, the fact is, we'll never really know. But his research has been thorough, and for my money, he makes a pretty compelling case. We'll see you next time.